She got a death notice for her husband for the second time. The first one came in 1974. A man in uniform stepped up to her porch, eyes lowered, and handed her an envelope. Inside were just a few lines. Sergeant Thomas W. Halley, presumed killed in action, no remains recovered. She buried the wedding ring he left behind, buried her 20s, buried the life they were supposed to have. And then, 40 years later, another letter arrived. This time from California, with the official letterhead of the Department of Veterans Affairs. We regret to inform you, Mr. Thomas Halley has passed away at a long-term care facility for veterans. How does a man die twice? She sat frozen in her wooden rocking chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Outside, the wind whispered across the porch, and in the distance, the old shirt she still hung out every Sunday swayed just enough to look like it was waving back. In the low hills of western North Carolina, where the pine trees stretch in long, quiet lines along the red clay roads, there's a small white wooden house tucked into the slope. The paint is chipped, the roof collects dry leaves, but the place is clean, warm, like an old memory that never left. Eliza lived there, alone, for almost 40 years. No children, no remarriage. She never once left the house, not even for a summer. To most folks in town, Eliza was that quiet, old widow who never owned a smartphone, never watched cable TV, and never had visitors, except for the mailman and a nurse who came by once a month. But if you ever sat on her porch with a strong cup of tea and enough patience to listen, you'd see Eliza wasn't lonely. She lived with memories, and in some strange, steady way, they lived with her. There was always a jar of fresh wildflowers on the table, sometimes asters, sometimes goldenrod, picked from the backyard. Near the window sat Thomas's old mandolin, polished, strings still tight, though no one had played it in years. Every Sunday morning, she hung out his shirt, the same faded cotton button-up, just like she used to when he was alive. She never said why, not even to herself. Anything that's been truly loved, she once said, never really disappears. The day the second letter arrived, Eliza was folding her linen handkerchiefs, same kind she'd used since she was 20. At first, she didn't recognize the name on the envelope, but the military print, sharp, formal, stopped her mid-fold. She set the cloth down, washed her hands, sat at the table, and opened the letter with one hand, while the other, almost instinctively, for the wedding photo beside her, as if needing a piece of the past to hold on to. She didn't cry, didn't gasp, just sat there for a long, still moment, staring through the lace curtain as the late sunlight touched the empty chair across the room. Once, there had been a man who sat there, reading the morning paper, humming old country songs, laughing in that deep, slow voice that made her want to cook him breakfast for the rest of her life. Once. Eliza lived slow. Not because of her age, but because there was no reason to rush. Each morning, she brewed tea, Earl Grey, strong, the way Thomas liked it. She herself preferred chamomile, but that didn't matter. She used the same cracked porcelain teapot, one chipped at the handle, but still good at holding heat. She poured it into the same blue ceramic mug, placed carefully on the same plate with faded flower rims. Always a pair, never changed. Breakfast was simple, cornbread or a slice of toast with peach jam, but she always set 2 sets of silverware, 2 napkins, one for herself and one for him. At noon, she read old library books with brittle pages, sometimes war novels, sometimes poetry. She liked Emily Dickinson best. She liked how Dickinson made silence sound like it had a voice. In the afternoons, she worked in the garden, pulled weeds from the tomato patch, trimmed the dying rose stems, picked up yellow leaves that had fallen from the grapevine. There was an old swing at the edge of the yard, frayed rope, one loose wooden plank. She still wiped it clean every week. That was where Thomas used to sit, cradling his mandolin, playing sad ballads. And every time he stopped in the middle of a tune, he'd turn to her and ask, "You think that one's too sad?" She'd smile, same every time. "Nothing's too sad if we're still sitting here together." At night, she never turned on the ceiling lights. Just one oil lamp, soft gold light glowing through the curtain. Enough to see the kettle, enough to feel like home. She wrote letters in the evening, not to anyone living, but to Thomas, to her younger self, to all the things that never quite came back. She never mailed them. She kept them in a wooden box beneath her bed. Over 200, handwritten in neat lines, as if writing them down was its own kind of survival. The day the letter came, it didn't rain, but the wind smelled like old rain, like something washed clean and half remembered. She was hanging dish towels behind the house when she heard the sound of the postman's motorbike. Clack, clack. Pause. Silence. Footsteps on gravel. Then the old wooden mailbox creaked open. A few seconds later, the engine started up again and disappeared into the hills. She didn't rush. Mail was usually just bank statements or local ads. But when she passed by, one yellow envelope stood out from the rest. The print was clean and unmistakable. Department of Veterans Affairs, California Division. Her heart didn't race. It slowed. The feeling wasn't fear. It was closer to standing in a familiar forest and seeing, out of nowhere, a tree that had been gone for decades, standing tall again, with bark and branches and shadow. Real. She brought it inside, set it on the table, washed her hands, sat down. This time, there was no one's hand to hold. The wedding photo was no longer beside her. She had put it away the week before, worried about dust. She opened the letter. The first line cut quietly, like thread snapping in the dark. "We regret to inform you." Only one page. It said that Thomas Halley, veteran, had passed away at a long-term care facility near Fresno. No known family, no visitors. His belongings, a notebook, an old mandolin, and a single faded photograph. A black and white photo. In it, Eliza, age 23, wearing a floral dress, standing on the porch, looking straight at the camera, smiling. The first time Eliza lost him, there was no body, no funeral, no folded flag delivered to the door. Just a letter, typed, cold, standard military format with her name printed at the top, last name spelled wrong. "We regret to inform you that Sergeant Thomas Halley has been listed as missing in action as of July 14th. That was it. No, "we're still looking," no detail about what part of the jungle, no one knocking on her door to explain what it meant to disappear inside a war. For days, she sat in the living room, still in her Sunday dress, as if waiting for the knock that never came. Neighbors dropped off pies, said, "We're praying," then left quickly, like they didn't know what to do with a woman whose husband had vanished into thin air. Her parents begged her to come back home, but she didn't. She stayed. Because something in her, something old and deep, refused to believe he was gone. Thomas was the kind of man who carved her initials into trees, who left her notes on napkins, who once walked 10 miles in a thunderstorm to bring her home from a bus stop because her car broke down. He wouldn't just leave, not without a word, not without a trace. So for months, she waited. Then years. She kept the house ready, never moved the coffee mug he used, left the porch light on every night, in case, just in case, he ever found his way back. People moved on. Wars ended, photos faded, But Eliza never remarried, never packed away the life they built. Some called it denial, some called it devotion. But to Eliza, it wasn't either. It was survival. At some point, people stopped asking. They stopped saying his name. Even the local pastor, who used to check in every Easter, stopped bringing up Tom. But Eliza never told herself to move on. She didn't even like the phrase. To her, moving on sounded like packing away something sacred just because it made others uncomfortable. So she let the ache stay. Not the sharp kind, not the kind that knocks you down in the middle of the night, but the quieter kind, the kind that sits next to you while you drink your tea, the kind that hums beneath every birthday cake never baked, every song that ends too soon, every letter without a stamp. Sometimes she thought she heard him, just faintly, his boots on the front steps, his cough in the hallway, his humming from the yard. It always passed, but she never tried to chase it away. She lived in that space between absence and hope, a life half tied to a man who may or may not still be breathing. And in that space, she built her rituals, her rhythms. She kept his old army jacket in the closet, washed it every fall. Once a year, she'd take it out, brush off the lint, run her hands along the seams, and fold it again, slowly, with both palms, like she was tucking in a ghost. The hardest part was not knowing. If he had died the day he disappeared, maybe she could have mourned, buried him, let herself fall apart, then stitch back together. But instead, it was a limbo, a long, aching maybe. And it was that maybe that shaped the rest of her life. The years rolled on, and the world around Eliza moved faster than she could keep up with. Phones buzzed, cars honked, new buildings rose where old trees once stood. But inside that little white house, time stayed still. And so did she. Neighbors stopped dropping by. Friends passed away. Even the mailman changed faces. But Eliza stayed the same, quiet, steadfast, a fixture as much as the cracked porch steps or the rusty mailbox. The war that took Thomas had faded from headlines. Memories of him slipped away from the minds of those who never met him. But not from hers. She held on, not because she refused to let go, but because she never really had the choice. Her grief wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the soft echo in empty rooms, the breath held just a little too long, the weight of silence that fills a house without its heart. And yet, in that quiet, something stubbornly bloomed. A hope, not quite hope. A faith, not quite belief. A thread connecting past to present. A whispered promise she wasn't ready to forget. Because some stories don't end with goodbye. Some wounds don't heal with time. They carry on, hidden, fragile, waiting. And that was Eliza's story. There was a number at the bottom of the letter, a contact at the care facility in Fresno. Eliza stared at it for 3 full days before she dialed. The voice on the other end was kind. Tired, but kind. Yes, ma'am. Thomas Halley was with us for nearly 11 years. He didn't speak much. He had episodes, PTSD, very advanced. Eliza didn't cry after the call. She didn't scream, didn't fall to her knees like the women in the movies do. Instead, she stood by the kitchen sink and washed her teacup, rinsed it, dried it, then turned off the light. That was how grief moved through her, like a tide, slow and salt-heavy, changing the shape of her without anyone noticing. In the weeks that followed, she began doing odd things. She polished the silver. She cleaned out the attic. She found a box of old photos and lined them up along the mantel, snapshots of a life that almost was. And then one morning, she opened the drawer where she'd kept every letter he ever sent before the war. She read them all, every single one. And for the first time, she answered back. She started writing him, not to be mailed, not to be read, just to say what had sat inside her chest for 40 years. Things like, "You would have loved the new dogwood trees on Maple Street. I still make your mother's peach pie. Never quite right, though. Sometimes I still hear your boots on the steps. And I know now why you didn't come back. And I forgive you." There was a pause. The nurse seemed to weigh her words. Most days, he didn't know what year it was. Sometimes, he thought he was still in the jungle. Other times, he'd just sit by the window, holding a photo of a young woman in a flowered dress. Eliza didn't say anything. The nurse continued. He carried that photo everywhere, even slept with it under his pillow. We never figured out where it came from. He didn't have any visitors, but every time we tried to move it, he'd get distressed. Eliza nodded slowly. Even though the woman couldn't see her, even though the silence felt too big for a phone line. "Did he ever say her name?" she asked. Another pause. Then, very softly, he called her Lizzie. For the first time in decades, Eliza felt something move in her chest, a strange warmth she didn't recognize. He hadn't forgotten her, not entirely, not even after the war broke his mind, not even after time bent everything else out of shape. Some part of him had kept her safe, a small corner of his shattered memory, where she was still waiting on a porch in a flowered dress. And maybe that was the reason he never came home. Not because he didn't love her, but because he loved her too much to bring the war into her house. There was no grand ceremony, no music swelling in the background, just the sound of pen on paper and the creak of the house breathing with her. Each letter she wrote loosened something old inside her, like knots untangling after a storm. Some days were harder than others. Grief doesn't move in straight lines. But in her own quiet way, Eliza had started to heal. Not by forgetting, but by finally understanding that love doesn't disappear when people do. Sometimes it just changes shape. It took her 3 weeks to book the flight, another 5 days to pack a single suitcase. Eliza hadn't left North Carolina in over 20 years, but something about the letter, the call, the name Lizzie, it moved a piece of her that had been frozen for too long. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. There was no one left to tell. The care facility was small, tucked between a gas station and a thrift store. It didn't look like much from the outside. Peeling paint, a sagging bench, a window where no one looked out. But when she walked through the door, a nurse met her with a soft smile, like she already knew. "He's out back. He likes the sun." Eliza nodded. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She walked slowly down the hall, past faded paintings and wheelchairs, past fragments of other people's stories. And then, there he was, sitting alone beneath a jacaranda tree, face tilted toward the sky, eyes closed. His hair was white now, thinner, his frame smaller than she remembered, but the line of his jaw, the way he held his hands in his lap, that was him, her Thomas. She didn't say his name. She just stood there and watched. After a moment, he turned, like some distant instinct told him someone familiar was near. His eyes met hers. No spark, no sudden recognition, just a long, searching stare. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not wide, not knowing, but gentle, like the ghost of something once beautiful. "Lizzie," he whispered. And for Eliza, that was enough. She didn't run to him, didn't cry. She just sat beside him and took his hand in hers. They stayed like that until the sun dipped behind the tree line. No explanations, no catching up. Just a woman and a man, and the strange, quiet grace of being together one last time. She didn't know it then, but that quiet afternoon under the tree would be the last time she ever saw him alive. 2 months later, the second letter arrived. Weeks passed. The house grew quieter, not in sound, but in feeling. There was no funeral, no obituary, not even a death certificate that made sense. Just a single page from the Department of Veterans Affairs and the ache in her ribs when she turned over at night and found no one there. She thought that was the end, of the story, of him, of all the things left unsaid, until the box came. It arrived on a Tuesday, no return address, just a simple label, property of Thomas Halley, release to next of kin. Inside, a worn leather-bound notebook cracked at the spine, 3 folded pages, 1 cassette tape, and a dog tag, tarnished but still legible. Eliza sat at the table for hours before she opened the notebook, and when she finally did, the air in the room shifted. The pages weren't tidy, the handwriting wasn't neat, just fragments, disjointed thoughts, half memories, scribbled words like he was trying to outrun something. Some pages were blank. Some only held a single sentence, like, "I left, but I never stopped being hers." Others were harder to read, written in the dark, maybe, or in panic. Rain, jungle, screaming, not mine. Don't open the box, don't open the box. She wore a yellow dress, I remember that, I remember that. Eliza turned each page slowly. Some of it didn't make sense. Some of it hurt more than she thought it would. But in the middle of the notebook, there was a full paragraph, shaky but clear. To Lizzie, if you ever read this, I'm sorry I never came home. I was too broken to be yours again, but you were always mine, even when I couldn't say your name. Eliza folded the book against her chest and let the silence hold her. It wasn't closure, not really, but it was truth, and sometimes that's the best ending you get. It took her a full day to find a cassette player, another hour to work up the courage to use it. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe a message? Maybe nothing. The tape clicked in. A faint hiss filled the room. Then, his voice. Cracked, dry, unsteady. At first, just mumbling. A cough, the rustle of bed sheets. Then, it's raining again. The floor's wet. I can't find my boots. Eliza leaned closer. They said I could go home, but I don't know where that is. A pause, and then his voice dropped like he was afraid someone might hear. She wore a flowered dress. Silence again. Breathing. The kind of breathing that comes before sleep or tears. And then, Lizzie? Eliza froze. Did you wait for me? Her throat tightened. I waited too. I tried to get back. The sound warped. Static bled through. A few clicks, maybe the recorder being dropped. And just before the tape cut off, tell her I never stopped looking for the porch light. Then, silence. A deep, final kind. Eliza sat perfectly still, hands clenched in her lap, heart pounding, not from sorrow, but from something softer, something like grace. She rewound the tape, listened again. Tell her I never stopped looking for the porch light. The same light she'd left on every night without even knowing why, until now. The days that followed didn't feel like grief. Not exactly. Not the kind that knocks you to your knees or makes you scream into the pillow at night. It was something else, quieter, like standing in the ocean after the tide has gone out. Still wet, still heavy, but Still, Eliza didn't cry, not the way she thought she would. She cooked her breakfast, fed the birds, kept the radio on low, even when the house was silent. She didn't try to forget, but she didn't chase the memories either. They came when they wanted, like wind through a cracked window. On the third morning, she picked up the notebook again. This time, she didn't read. She just held it, ran her fingers over the worn cover, closed her eyes, and imagined his hands writing in the dark, trying to catch memories before they slipped away forever. She whispered, "You made it home, Tom, just not the way either of us expected." A week later, she drove to the coast. The same stretch of beach they used to talk about visiting, but never did. She brought the cassette with her, played it in the car, one last time, let his voice mix with the sound of waves crashing outside. When it ended, she rolled down the window, held the tape in her hand, then let the wind take it. Not out of bitterness, but release. He didn't belong to the war anymore. He didn't belong to the institution or the pain or the years lost. He belonged to her memory now, and she was ready to carry it. Back home, Eliza started making small changes. She cleaned out the attic, donated the extra dishes, repainted the porch railing. Not because she was erasing him, but because life was happening again, and it was time she stepped into it. She started writing letters, not to Thomas, but to other widows, to younger women in town who had lost partners. She wrote about porch lights and waiting and the kind of love that lives in silence. Some wrote back, some didn't. That was okay. One evening in late fall, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, wrapped in a thick shawl, the light above her head buzzing softly in the dusk. A neighbor passed by, a young girl walking her dog. She waved, then pointed to the bulb and said, "You always leave that light on." Eliza smiled. "I do." The girl paused. "Waiting for someone?" Eliza looked up at the amber glow, thought for a second, then said, "No, sweetheart. I think I'm just not ready to turn it off yet." The girl nodded, didn't ask more, kept walking. Eliza sipped her tea, closed her eyes, listened to the crickets, the creak of the wooden swing, the rhythm of a quiet life continuing. Some stories end with a door slamming, others end with a whisper. This one ends with a light, still glowing, not because someone's coming, but because someone did.